It's time to start again. So welcome back, everybody. This is your hourly or so reminder that you are being recorded and your faces and your voices will be broadcast out on Facebook and through YouTube eventually. So if you do not wish this to happen, then please turn off your videos. And if you don't want to have your voices out there, then just watch the Facebook feed. It's happening live right now. That said, we are ready for our second presenter. Our second presenter is Mr. Tim Duffy from Chicago. He lives there with his wife, Betty Ann, and his son, Kevin. Tim is semi-retired. He's a semi-retired attorney and is most recently a serial entrepreneur. He has been a student of this book since 1986. In the past few years, he's been active in various study groups in the Chicago area, as well as he's been a teacher facilitator for the Urantia Book Internet School. Tim, the room is yours.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much. And thank you for everybody for participating and allowing me to do this. I wish you hadn't told me how many people were online, because it was more comforting to think there were only the 10 or 20 I could see at a time, but I'll just put that to the back of my mind. The topic I'm going to talk about and hopefully discuss with you the next hour is called Discerning the Father's Will. And the idea for this stemmed from actually a course I'm currently teaching at UBIS and taught in a prior semester that focused on the final hours of Jesus's life. And in that course, we had a lot of new readers, and it was very a very interesting course. And you know, the primary thing I think those students struggled with was how to reconcile the ideas or what to make of the idea of the crucifixion, of Jesus' suffering, and what role God's will played in that. And so that raised obviously a lot of interesting questions, and I developed this presentation a little bit out of some of those themes. So anyway, let's get right to it so we don't have a huge amount of time. Let me share my screen here so you can see what I'm reading. Just gonna have some excerpts here on the screen if it's easier for you to follow along there as we go forward. So obviously, you know, the importance of doing the Father's will, the primacy of the Father's will, both in the universe perspective and both in terms of our lives, is front and center. This quote is from actually the second page of the text of the book. Paper 1, the affectionate dedication of the human will to the doing of the Father's will is man's choicest gift to God. In fact, such a consecration of creature will constitutes man's only possible gift of true value to the Paradise Father. In God, man lives, moves, and has his being. There is nothing which man can give to God except this choosing to abide by the Father's will, and such decisions, affected by the intelligent will creatures of the universes, constitute the reality of that true worship which is so satisfying to the love-dominated nature of the Creator Father. So right up front, there's probably nothing more important, right, than dedicating ourselves, consecrating our will to the Father's will. So that immediately raises the question, well, how do we figure out what that will is? And a lot of people, a lot of us, whether it's from other traditions or just thinking logically, the supposition is sort of, well, there's God's plan, there's God's will, and we have to figure out what that is and then do it. My proposition to you for this next hour is that might be true on some levels, but it's not a very helpful way to think of things. And we can move through the book a little bit and find some other clues as to what it really means to find the Father's will, and therefore hopefully to do the Father's will. So if we skip ahead a little bit, this is in one of the Thought Adjuster papers, the consecration of choice. We get a little more gloss on it. The Father's will is not just something that we discover and then follow, like a puzzle that we solve, but it actually involves our will and putting our will to the Father's will, consecrating our will to the Father, not just figuring out and following, but actually dedicating our will to it. The doing of the will of God is nothing more or less than an exhibition of creature willingness to share the inner life with God, with the very God who has made such a creature life of inner meaning, value possible. Sharing is godlike, divine. God shares all with the eternal Son and the infinite Spirit. while they in turn share all things with the divine sons and daughters of the universe. The imitation of God is the key to perfection. The doing of his will is the secret of survival and of perfection in survival. Mortals live in God, and so God has willed to live in mortals. As men trust themselves to him, so has he, and first, trusted a part of himself to be with men. He consented to live in men and to indwell men subject to the human will. Of course, they're talking about the thought adjusters, which is the subject of this paper. But you see here in these quotes, there's a linkage of the two wills. It's not simply following, they're linked together. So reading on. Peace in this life, survival in death, perfection in the next life, service in eternity, all these are achieved in spirit now when the creature personality consents, chooses to subject the creature will to the Father's will, and already has the Father chosen to make a fragment of himself subject to the will of the creature personality. In other words, the thought adjuster, God himself, is subject in part to our choices. Such a creature choice is not a surrender of will. It is a consecration of will, an expansion of will, a glorification of will, a perfecting of will. And such choosing raises the creature from the level of temporal significance to that higher estate wherein the personality of the creature son communes with the personality of the Spirit Father. So it's very interactive. It's an exercise. It's a creative endeavor. It's not simply a following of a rope, so to speak. It's weaving it together, both God on the one extreme and us at the other. This choosing of the Father's will is the spiritual finding of the Spirit Father by mortal man, even though an age must pass before the creature son may actually stand in the factual presence of God on paradise. This choosing does not so much consist in the negation of creature will, not my will but yours be done, as it consists in the creature's positive affirmation, it is my will that your will be done. And if this choice is made, sooner or later, the God-choosing Son find inner union, fusion with the indwelling God fragment, while the same perfecting Son will find supreme personality satisfaction in the worship communion of the personality of man and the personality of his maker, two personalities whose creative attributes have eternally joined in self-willed mutuality of expression, the birth of another eternal partnership of the will of man and the will of God. So you can see, I think, from these, from this paper, which is, one of the more powerful ones in the book, how complex this is, how rich this is. It's not simply let's figure out what's best, let's figure out what the Father wants. It's let's join him, let's be like him, let's participate, let's make ourselves in a way, let's make ourselves in his image as we are made in his image, I guess you could even say. And let me sort of put another piece on it, which Jesus gives us a little bit later in the book. This is from paper 130. He's talking to Gannett, and there's a couple really interesting passages here, I think. So this kind of picks up midstream, but it says this was a conference which lasted well into the night, in the course of which the young man, Gannett, requested Jesus to tell him the difference between the will of God and that human mind act of choosing, which is also called will. In substance, Jesus said, the will of God is the way of God, partnership with the choice of God in the face of any potential alternative. To do the will of God, therefore, is the progressive experience of becoming more and more like God. And God is the source and destiny of all that is good and beautiful and true. The will of man is the way of man, the sum and substance of that which the mortal chooses to be and do. Will is the deliberate choice of a self-conscious being, which leads to decision conduct based on intelligent reflection. And then a little bit later down the page, and I've just sort of recently came across this very short paragraph. I think it's very remarkable. It was on, and it's almost as an aside. The midwares relay this almost as an aside in this paper. It was on the same day that we first heard that momentous truth, which, stated in modern terms, would signify Will is that manifestation of the human mind which enables the subjective consciousness to express itself objectively and to experience the phenomenon of aspiring to be God-like. And it is in this same sense that every reflective and spiritually minded human being can become creative. Our will, our dedication of our will to the Father's will, is portrayed here as becoming God-like. Actually, as God exercised his will to sustain, to create the universe, to sustain the universe, to create us, to indwell us, we are exercising our will within our sphere in the same creative way. And in so many ways, I think, as we become spirits, learning to be actually like him. Very powerful in this, you know, they say it, momentous truth. There's no other discussion of this anywhere else. It's a very small excerpt, so I thought it was quite powerful. And I think it actually ties in with something that David said in his presentation. You know, we grow through our decisions. You know, it's these sort of choices we make, as you know, or as you know, as we talked about just recently, as you know, as we pass by, what do we do for people? It's that becoming as Jesus was, becoming God-like, making our choices not just to figure out, oh, that, you know, it's A not B, or it's B not C, but you know, it's creating in our own choices the same sorts of things that God would do were he here, and he is here, he's in us, and therefore partnering with that and becoming, as it says, God-like. Very powerful. I'm gonna, you know, for all this discussion, and obviously there's lots of other places in the book that talk about will and God's will. There's very few places in the book, though, that you actually get an insight in a particular context as to what God's will is, or what God's will was in a particular context. And of course, the most powerful example of that, and the one place you do get some detail on it, is with Jesus's suffering and death. So that's what we're going to turn to in a minute, as sort of an example of how this creative endeavor of choosing, of finding the Father's will, of choosing the Father's will, of in effect creating with the Father, how this works in practice. And we're going to look at some things from the crucifixion. But before we get into that, let me pause and take any comments or questions on the stuff that I've talked about so far. Let me pull up the little things here. Maybe I'll stop my screen share and give myself one more space so I can see all the people. Okay, great. Ranji?
Yes, it was really insightful, but my question is, Jesus understood the will of God because they were in constant communication. But human beings are not. I don't know about others, but I try to talk. I want my Father to talk to me physically, like you are doing to us, which is not happening. Then I am doing something. What is my will? And I am thinking that is God's will. I know it is not right. Will you be able to highlight onto that?
Yeah, well, that's a good that's a good question. It's the kind of thing that we all face in our lives at one point in time, right? And I think what we might see as we go forward here, it gets really complicated really fast, because not only is there God's will and our will, but there's usually some other person involved. and,
Right.
and they have a will too. And when we see what happened to Jesus, obviously there's lots of other people involved, and these other people wanted to kill him, and they did. So, you know, what was God's will in there and what wasn't? The thing that we have power over is our own choices. And all we can do, and all Jesus could do, I submit to you, faced with the choices of everyone around him, was decide how he was going to respond, how he was going to act. And maybe it would work. Maybe it would convince someone to make the right choice. Maybe it wouldn't. Maybe they would reject him. Maybe it would serve as an example to his followers or to the universe. Maybe it wouldn't. But he made those choices, and I actually think all God wanted him to do is to make the best choices that he could. There's some other examples. We don't have time to get into them. Like when you look at the wedding at Cana and turning the water into wine. Well, it must have been God's will. The water turned into wine. Jesus was surprised by that. He didn't so yeah, obviously he had more insight into God's will than you or I, but it's not a predetermined. I submit to you, it's not the old Calvinist doctrine of everything is exactly predetermined. It's our choices, and our choices in a context, and God wants us to make the best ones we can. He doesn't know, or he chooses not to know what we're going to do. And it's a very dynamic, very complex formula, but all we can do is make the choices we have control over and trust in the big picture it's going to work out, I think, at least.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure. Anybody else? Gail.
Hi. Going back to the wedding at Cana, sometimes it seems almost that things are not so much God's will in that case, but not against his will, in that when that happened with the water being turned into wine, it's just the beings around him created that time intervention so that the water became wine, and it wasn't against God's will. And it's always been a little interesting thing. I mean, for my own personal experience anyhow, and journey, I guess, is just determining when I can't tell what God's will is, I have to sometimes just turn it over. And when I'm looking for direction and guidance, is to say, if it isn't against your will, God. And so I don't know exactly where I'm going with that, but just an observation that maybe it wasn't God's will that they had wine, it's just that it wasn't
Right.
against his will.
No, that's I think that's exactly true, and it's very interesting, as you say, in all these instances in Jesus' life where this happens, and they talk about it. They do not say it was God's will. They say it was not inconsistent with God's will. And even Jesus at the healing at sundown, he says, God, if it's okay with you, go ahead and heal these people. Not, if it's not inconsistent with your will, I guess I'd want these people to be healed. and he doesn't. So, I mean, his human mind, at least, he doesn't know. But he says, if it's not inconsistent, it really would be nice. And it happens. But did it have to happen? Did it, was there a pre-choice by God to happen? No, I don't think so. It's because it's Jesus creating at that moment, making the choice, calling on his powers, obviously, not that we share, but, in his sphere, his powers. And like you say, not inconsistent. I think God gives us all kinds of room. In fact, maybe I think for a lot of people, too much room to mess up, right? I mean, an infinite array of choices, and we're stuck with our own decisions. That's what's really hard about life, right? If all we had to do was listen to the priest or figure out whether A was better than B or B was better than C, well, then it'd be a lot easier. But we have this broad range of things we can do. Lots of them are probably consistent with God's will. But our task is to make the best ones we can and somehow navigate that with everyone else making their choices too, some of which are good, some of which are bad. But I'll talk a little more at the end about, I think God's approach to that. It's not unlike as all these complicated things in the Urantia book come down to, the father-parent-child relationship. What do you want for your kids? What's your will with your child? You want them to grow up, you want them to be successful. Maybe you harbor some, they're going to follow in your footsteps or something, but most of us just want them to be happy, want them to be a loving person, want them to be a good person. We don't care how they do it, but we want it to be the best for them, right? I think God has a little bit of that same attitude. Well, how does God want this to play out in this situation? Well, I want you guys to do the best you can. I want you to create something meaningful. I want you to grow yourself. And that's what he wants. David.
Yeah, I was going to promise not to say anything after people were tired of hearing from me, but the last thing you said just provoked me into a response. I think it's more just than whether or not we know whether it's God will or it's okay. I mean, we're on a different footing from Jesus, but I think the fact that we are going to get it wrong a lot is part of the deal. It's part of the plan of God the Father looking for every possibility to grow the universe back through our growth through the grand universe, through time and space. And it's okay that we get it wrong, as long as we're trying to be sincere every time, because that's how we're going to grow. If we weren't going to make mistakes in doing the best we can and not get God's will right, then he wouldn't be able to have us be the partner that he does to do the ungodlike thing.
Right. We wouldn't have freedom. One more comment, Philip.
Yeah, I was going to ask about free will. How does that play a part in here? Often people choose to do the wrong thing.
Right. And I think the book is very clear. That was as soon as if God is going to give us the ability to exercise our will, that comes with the ability to make the wrong choice or the right choice. It is a freedom. It is a responsibility. It's the thing that makes it meaningful, right? Because if you can't mess up, what good is, or what value is making the right choice, or what growth is there if you only have really one choice? And it's that gift that is, in the long run, certainly a gift and a benefit to us from the short perspective, from the immediate perspective, from the stuck in the corners of time and space perspective. Sometimes it's not so pleasant, right?
Thank you.
Okay, great. Let me put my screen back up here. Okay, so let's move right into probably the most famous example, but one I think that gives people lots of trouble because it's so emotional and it's so almost out of character in a way for the rest of Jesus's life. This is obviously from the when he was alone in Gethsemane, and these are his three prayers to the Father. My Father, I came into this world to do your will, and so have I. I know that the hour has come to lay down this life in the flesh, and I do not shrink therefrom. But I would know that it is your will that I drink this cup. Send me the assurance that I will please you in my death, even as I have in my life. And then the second time, Father, I know it is possible to avoid this cup. All things are possible with you, but I have come to do your will. And while this is a bitter cup, I would drink it if it is your will. So he's asked twice now. Presumably he would, well, we tend to think he would just know, but his human mind, at least, maybe even if he did, it's not certain enough, it's not hardwired in him enough. He's asking the question and he gets an actual answer. And when he had thus prayed, a mighty angel came down by his side and speaking to him, touched him and strengthened him. The third time, Father, you see my sleeping apostles, have mercy upon them. The spirit is indeed willing, but the flesh is weak. Oh, now, Father, if this cup may not pass, then I would drink it. Not my will, but yours be done. He has the the sort of the more negative formulation of it there. But let's go to the just a little further in the same section to the explanation of what this angel said to him. Each time he prayed in the garden, his humanity laid a firmer faithhold upon his divinity. His human will became more completely became one with the divine will of his Father. Among other words spoken to him by the mighty angel was the message that the Father desired his Son to finish his earth bestowal by passing through the creature experience of death, just as all mortal creatures must experience material dissolution and passing from the existence of time into the progression of eternity. So this is the culmination of his bestowal. It's obviously the most difficult part of his existence. He has these explicit prayers to the Father. The sweat is coming off his brow. And what is he actually told by an angel? He said, no, the Father wants you, well, not no. The Father wants you to have a natural death. Doesn't say you have to go through suffering. Doesn't say you have to be have the crown of thorns. Doesn't say anything other than, no, we want you to have this natural death. again, what we were just talking about, I think there's a range of possibilities, right? The Father's will, as at least is expressed through this message from the angel, is very general. There's a number of ways that it could be outcomes that would still be consistent with it, or not inconsistent with the Father's will. Just to finish out the story here, because I think it's appropriate. Earlier in the evening, it had not seemed so difficult to drink the cup, but as the human Jesus bade farewell to his apostles and sent them to their rest, the trial grew more appalling. Jesus experienced that natural ebb and flow of feeling which is common to all human experience. And just now, when he was weary from work, exhausted from the long hours of strenuous labor and painful anxiety concerning the safety of his apostles, well, no mortal can presume to understand the thoughts and feelings of the incarnate Son of God at such a time as this. We know that he endured great anguish and suffered untold sorrow, for the perspiration rolled off his face in great drops. He was at last convinced that the Father intended to allow natural events to take their course. He was fully determined to employ none of his sovereign power as the supreme head of a universe to save himself. So he gets the message from the angel, a natural death, and therefore he decides, all right, I'm going to go through this naturally. I'm not going to call upon any of my superhuman powers to make it easier, to get myself out of it, to, even if he's not thinking of himself, to lessen the burden or that it's going to be for my followers, or the risk to them. But again, we don't yet know at this point in the story, so to speak, all that entails, and we get a little more insight in a section that follows, entitled "The Father's Will." If there's one section that I think the most important on this topic, it's probably this one. There is great danger of misunderstanding the meaning of numerous sayings and many events associated with the termination of the Master's career in the flesh. The cruel treatment of Jesus by the ignorant servants and the callous soldiers, the unfair conduct of his trials, and the unfeeling attitude of the professed religious leaders must not be confused with the fact that Jesus, in patiently submitting to all this suffering and humiliation, was truly doing the will of the Father in paradise. It was indeed and in truth the will of the Father that his Son should drink to the full the cup of mortal experience from birth to death. But the Father in heaven had nothing whatever to do with instigating the barbarous behavior of those supposedly civilized human beings who so brutally tortured the Master and so horribly heaped successive indignities upon his non-resisting person. These inhuman and shocking experiences, which Jesus was called upon to endure in the final hours of his mortal life, were not in any sense a part of the divine will of the Father, which his human nature had so triumphantly pledged to carry out at the time of the final surrender of man to God, as signified in the threefold prayer which he indited in the garden while his weary apostles slept the sleep of physical exhaustion. And there's probably nothing that's caused more confusion in religion, generally on this planet, is mixing up these two ideas. So Father has said, I want you to pass out of this life the way everyone passes out of life, through a natural death. And Jesus accepted that. He let natural events take its course. But all the particulars about how that happened are still yet to be up to the other individuals involved, and it's still up to Jesus how he's going to respond to that. He said he's not going to use his superhuman powers. He's got other abilities besides his superhuman powers. He chooses not to even use his human abilities to get out of it, which I think is an even more hard thing for us to get our arms around sometime. But those are choices. Those are Jesus's choices. Those are the choices of his enemies, his torturers, his murderers, not the choice of God, even though this falls within the more general allowance, if you will, of what God's will would be, because it is, in fact, a natural way to die, although it's not obviously not a one that any of us would have wished upon Jesus, but yet it happened because of the choices, because of all the other choices, because of Jesus's choices leading up to it. said here, probably better than I was rambling. The Father in heaven desired the bestowal Son to finish his earth career naturally, just as all mortals must finish up their lives on earth and in the flesh. Ordinary men and women cannot expect to have their last hours on earth and the supervening episode of death made easy by a special dispensation. Accordingly, Jesus elected to lay down his life in the flesh in the manner which was in keeping with the outworking of natural events, and he steadfastly refused to extricate himself from the cruel clutches of a wicked conspiracy of inhuman events, which swept on with horrible certainty toward his unbelievable humiliation and ignominious death. And every bit of all this astounding manifestation of hatred and this unprecedented demonstration of cruelty was the work of evil men and wicked mortals. God in heaven did not will it. Neither did the archenemies of Jesus dictate it, though they did much to ensure that unthinking and evil mortals would thus reject the bestowal Son. Even the father of sin turned his face away from the excruciating horror of the scene of the crucifixion. And as I said to Raji a few minutes ago, you know, this is where it gets really complicated because in the real world, in real situations, and especially in tough situations, we're not just dealing with our own will, we're dealing with the will of usually of other people. And so Jesus wasn't just making this choice in isolation. He's making a choice of how to respond, how to act in the context of a firestorm of will choices directed at him that, you know, hopefully, well, that none of us, you know, could possibly even, you know, really imagine. And so, how does that play into what not so much is God's will, but what is Jesus's will? What is Jesus's will creating at this point, confronted with these choices of his creatures in this you know awful form? So we get some insight in this in paper 186 in this section on the Master's attitude. When Jesus was arrested, he knew that his work on earth in the likeness of mortal flesh was finished. He fully understood the sort of death he would die, and he was little concerned with the details of his so-called trials. Before the Sanhedrin's court, Jesus declined to make replies to the testimony of perjured witnesses. There was but one question which would always elicit an answer, whether asked by friend or foe, and that was the one concerning the nature and divinity of his mission on earth. When asked if he were the Son of God, he unfailingly made reply. He steadfastly refused to speak when in the presence of the curious and wicked Herod. Before Pilate, he spoke only when he thought that Pilate or some other sincere person might be helped to a better knowledge of the truth by what he said. Jesus had taught his apostles the uselessness of casting their pearls before swine, and now he dared to practice what he had taught. His conduct at this time exemplified the patient submission of the human nature, coupled with the majestic silence and solemn dignity of the divine nature. He was altogether willing to discuss with Pilate any question related to the political charges brought against him, any question which he recognized as belonging to the governor's jurisdiction. This next passage is really important, I think. Jesus was convinced that it was the will of the Father that he submit himself to the natural and ordinary course of human events, just as every other mortal creature must. And therefore, he refused to employ even his purely human powers of persuasive eloquence to influence the outcome of the machinations of his socially nearsighted and spiritually blinded fellow mortals. Let me pause here for just a second and let's look at this sentence. Okay, so Jesus was convinced that he go through this naturally, submit himself to the natural course of human events, just as everyone else has to do. Well, if you or I were in that situation, how many of us would not try at least to talk our way out of it a little bit, right? Jesus was not interested in that. He therefore refused to employ even his human powers of persuasive eloquence. He doesn't have to call down the legion of angels to get out of this. He probably just has to speak convincingly to some of these folks and change their mind, or at least give them pause. Or, you know, Pilate at some points in the ordeal is a little bit on the edge. He probably could have been persuaded the other way. He was a vacillating person as it was. He probably could have been, bolstered and through wholly human means by Jesus, but yet he still chose not to do that. Now, one theory as well, Jesus was, he wanted to do this. He wanted to sort of make the show of it. He wanted this to happen because it was so dramatic, because it was, you know, he's putting on this demonstration for us and for his universe. And maybe there's something to that, but the more important thing, I think, as we're talking about, you know, what's the will of the Father and what choice is he making? What I think, at least, what he's doing here is he's actually respecting the will of his sons and daughters, as opposed, just as God gives us that freedom, as we just talked about, to make mistakes, to make the wrong choices, to not impinge on our free will. Here's Jesus, his children are coming at him with swords and sticks and everything else, and he chooses not to fight them or even try to argue his way out of it. He chooses to let them let them make their choice. And maybe he knew how some of it was going to come out, but you know, each person in that drama had at some point had choices to make. And I'm sure there were people involved who turned away, the ones who, you know, left and maybe didn't support it, the ones who you know, the ones who stayed and did. And how and I think one of the things that underlies this is, if Jesus could have just, you know, talked his way out of it to some of these people, in a way that's interfering in some sense with their choice, but he was committed to letting that play out, and in so doing that, and in submitting to their choice, and we have to talk about the whole idea of his philosophy of non-resistance, which is a whole nother sort of stream here, you know, ends up demonstrating his love for them, which we're going to see in the next sections. These short-sighted Jews clamored unseemingly for the master's death, while he stood there in awful silence, looking upon the death scene of a nation, his earthly father's own people. Jesus had acquired that type of human character which could preserve its composure and assert its dignity in the face of continued and gratuitous insult. He could not be intimidated. When first assaulted by the servant of Annas, he only suggested the propriety of calling witnesses who might duly testify against him. From first to last, in his so-called trial before Pilate, the onlooking celestial host could not refrain from broadcasting to the universe the depiction of the scene of Pilate on trial before Jesus. When before Caiaphas, and when all the perjured testimony had broken down, Jesus did not hesitate to answer the question of the chief priests, thereby providing in his own testimony that which they desired as the basis for convicting him of blasphemy. The master never displayed the least interest in Pilate's well-meant but half-hearted efforts to effect his release. He really pitied Pilate and sincerely endeavored to enlighten his darkened mind. He was wholly passive to all the Roman governor's appeals to the Jews to withdraw the criminal charges against him. Throughout the whole sorrowful ordeal, he bore himself with simple dignity and unostentatious majesty. He would not so much cast reflections of insincerity upon his would-be murderers when they asked if he were king of the Jews. With but little qualifying explanation, he accepted the designation, knowing that when they had chosen to reject him, he would be the last to afford them real national leadership, even in a spiritual sense. Jesus said little during these trials, but he said enough to show all mortals the kind of human character man can perfect in partnership with God, and to reveal to all the universe the manner in which God can become manifest in the life of the creature when such a creature truly chooses to do the will of the Father, thus becoming an active son of the living God. His love for ignorant mortals is fully disclosed by his patient and great self-possession in the face of the jeers, blows, and buffetings of the coarse soldiers and the unthinking servants. He was not even angry when they blindfolded him and, derisively striking him in the face, exclaimed, "Prophesy to us who it was that struck you." Pilate spoke more truly than he knew when, after Jesus had been scourged, he presented him to before the multitude, exclaiming, "Behold the man." Indeed, the fear-ridden Roman governor little dreamed that at just that moment, the universe stood at attention, gazing upon this unique scene of its beloved sovereign, thus subjected in humiliation to the taunts and blows of his darkened and degraded mortal subjects. And as Pilate spoke, there echoed throughout all Nebadon, "Behold God in man." Throughout a universe, untold millions have ever since that day continued to behold the man, while the God of Havana, the supreme ruler of the universe of universes, accepts the man of Nazareth as the satisfaction of the ideal of the mortal creatures of this local universe of time and space. In his matchless life, he never failed to reveal God to man. Now, in these final episodes of his moral career and in his subsequent death, he made a new and touching revelation of man to God. One more little paragraph here from just a little bit later in the same section. It was man and not God who planned and executed the death of Jesus on the cross. True, the Father refused to interfere with the march of human events on Urantia, but the Father in paradise did not decree, demand, or require the death of his Son as it was carried out on earth. It is a fact that in some manner, sooner or later, Jesus would have had to divest himself of his mortal body, his incarnation in the flesh, but he could have executed such a task in countless ways without dying on a cross between two thieves. All of this was man's doing, not God's. And the part that I sort of want you to think about, and maybe we can discuss a little bit, it was man's doing, and it was also Jesus's choice to submit to that, and that's really the crux of the cross, if you will. Not just his decision to experience that as a mortal, but to really take it one step farther and experience it as a mortal who is not going to resist it, who is going to allow these other creatures, his creatures whom he loves, to make their choices, not try and change them, and to reap the consequences of those, whether they be positive or negative. And obviously there's a lot of positive consequences that flow from his choice in response to those actions, or even their negative choices, in that they provide a context and a lesson for, obviously countless other people. That's really the hard part. But to go back to the first part of our discussion, what is Jesus doing? He's not just following what he thinks is the Father's will. He's creating a spiritual reality. He's exercising his will. He's choosing how he responds, how he doesn't respond, what he says, what he doesn't say, what powers he exercises, what he doesn't exercise, all within the broader spectrum of the Father's will, complying with the general requirement, but in the particulars, really putting something together that demonstrates his love for his sons and daughters on the planet, even the ones who are slapping him in the face and killing him. And that is obviously has God's approval, obviously, an awesome thing to be doing. Obviously, God wants his paradise creator son to succeed in that endeavor, but the particulars of it, it's his creation. It's not God's, so to speak. So if we bring that back to our lives a little bit, as we make these choices on a smaller scale, hopefully less, of lesser importance, but still important to us, we have that same creative power. How do we handle a situation? How do we respond to a situation? What choices do we make in a situation? How do we show love for each other? How do we show a respect for everyone else as well, yet stay within the bounds of the Father's will? That's really the question for us. Let me open it up for a little more discussion. I have a couple closing thoughts, but now might be a good time to stop if people have comments. Susan.
Yes, I just sort of thought this is the perfect example of turning the other cheek.
Right. Right. And, that phrase, I find that so many people outside the context of religion, just casually, they think, that means, well, just put up with things, right? but it doesn't. It's a very, I think the point here is that it's offering the other cheek, right? That makes that important. Yeah. And it's a very active choice. Well, what can I do? I can yell and scream. I can, fight back. I can pull. I can try and dodge the next bullet, or I can say, oh, you want to hit me? All right, here's the other one.
Yeah.
And very, very powerful. I think it's very hard for any of us to really understand it, because it's just so far from our natural instinct and reaction, I think. And that's what makes it so powerful. Yeah.
And it's a completely conscious decision, it's
right. Right. It's not a negation. It's not a giving up or a failure. It's a very affirmative, creative act. David? David Henry.
Yeah,
Oh, there you go.
You know, Jesus was in his mid-30s when he left this world. I often pondered, and I've thought about this a lot, why couldn't he have taken the apostles and the disciples and the Greeks that were with him and just headed to Greece or Rome, or he could have lived, who knows, 80 years old,
right,
whatever. He could have done a lot here. Jesus had announced as Michael in Salvington that he was coming to this planet 35,000 years or more. Even when Adam and Eve was still here, he decided this was where he was going to make his incarnation. Well, 2,000 years before he showed up, Melchizedek came. And one of the things Melchizedek did between the time of his incarnation and the time Jesus was here was to work with the prophets and seers. And these were the prophets of Israel. Now, Jesus is independent of time. He's not independent of space. He had to have known how things were going to unfold on this world since he's independent of time. If Melchizedek made promises through the prophets, and many of those things have come to pass, some of those things we're about to go through, and some of those things are off 1,000 years in the future. Did Jesus know that if he got up and left, that would upset the balance of what was about to transpire on this planet over the next 2,000 years? Now, as a creator son on Salvington, maybe it was a little easier for him to go through this. But it was different when he was living here as a human being, which is why creator sons have to incarnate as a human being. This is what it's like. So yeah, I put a lot of thought into this. I think that has a lot to do with the kind of behavior that Jesus went through at the time of his death. I remember an event with another Urantian, and this is strictly from a human point of view. I was helping a buddy take down a TV antenna. You remember those things? I was up on the roof at the chimney, and I undid it, and there was a long pole down there. And as I was letting loose of it, I looked down and I yelled down to him, "Now I know how the angels see things." Well, something went wrong and he really injured his arm, and it didn't look like anything to me. But when I got down on the ground and realized how injured he was, it was like, okay, you know what? It's really different when you walk the path of this earth. And I think has a lot to do with what transpired. Jesus could have easily left Jerusalem, but he didn't.
Right. Yeah. No.
The Urantia book's quiet about that.
Yeah. No. That's how I got into this whole topic. Like, okay, fine. You know, he knew the soldiers were coming. He could have skedaddled an hour beforehand, and I'm sure made his way safely out. Right. I mean, they hit him when he was an infant. You know, they took him to Egypt, right? So he wouldn't get killed. Why not just, why not do this? Now, you know, there's a whole line of thought, I think, alluded to it a little bit, that, well, he wanted to to have this drama play out as a spectacle, and it's so powerful and it's sort of engineered. I personally, I don't think that's really it. I think that sort of denigrates it in a way. I don't know that I mean, could he have known? Did he know certain things were likely to happen? I don't think he knew that's how it was going to end when he started his mission, his public mission. I think he knew there was risk, but when he saw these, but he, you know, he didn't do something that was going to abandon his friends, abandon his people, abandon his family, abandon even the people that were out to kill him, because they were the ones that were there. And you know, he could have run away from them, but you know, I mean, imagine a father being attacked by his son with a knife. Well, yeah, a human father might run away. The divine father probably wouldn't. He'd say, oh, gee, you know, I really love you. If you want to kill me, okay, all right, let's, you know, but I'm not leaving, because I'm here and I'm here for you. And that's the, you know, sort of the more of the dynamic, I think.
Yeah.
But anyway.
You know, the Midwayers make a really curious comment about Jesus living here as a human being, and his divine mind, how they don't understand how it was that he could turn on the divine mind and turn it off. Right. They say that's a mystery. So I think that might play into it too.
Yeah, I think he kept it off all the time, except when he had to talk to Gabriel about something or whatever. But you know, real quick, Marian, and then let me give you a few closing thoughts. Oh, she put her hand down, I think. So, all right, just oh, there you are. Good.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
My theory is that he knew that the spirit of truth needed to come to these, especially to these apostles and to this planet. And so, yeah, maybe he could have lived to be a ripe old age, but so would have the apostles aged. And they weren't getting it as to who he was and what was really going on until Pentecost. And so it was timely, I believe, so that there would be enough time for the apostles to take his message throughout the Greco-Roman Empire and start preaching. And also very dramatic.
Oh, I think you froze up a little bit, or hopefully I'm not the one frozen. Sometimes you can't tell. But yes, that's a very good point. You know, his purpose here is not like Caligastia or Adam and Eve that was supposed to stay around and, you know, advance civilization. He's here for a short time, and I do think that's a good point. Just a few closing thoughts here. This is from the section, the meaning of the death on the cross. The triumph of the death on the cross is summed up in the spirit of Jesus's attitude towards those who assailed him. He made the cross an eternal symbol of the triumph of love over hate and the victory of truth over evil when he prayed, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." That devotion of love was contagious throughout a vast universe. The disciples caught it from their master. The first teacher of his gospel, who was called upon to lay down his life in this service, said, as they stoned him to death, "Lay not this sin to their charge." That's Marion's point right there. Very soon, the idea is taking root. The cross makes a supreme appeal to the best in man because it discloses one who was willing to lay down his life in the service of his fellow men. Greater love no man can have than this, that he would be willing to lay down his life for his friends. And Jesus had such a love that he was willing to lay down his life for his enemies, a love greater than any which had hitherto been known on Urantia. On the other worlds, as well as on Urantia, the sublime spectacle of the death of the human Jesus on the cross of Golgotha has stirred the emotions of mortals, while it has aroused the highest devotion of the angels. And with that, it is time for me to pass it back to Chris.
Thank you, Tim.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Everyone, this is your 5-minute break. Go get some water and be back here in 5 minutes. And you're unmuted if you'd like to talk or to discuss things.